Welcome back. In this video, we'll be going over clocking in and out and shift notes for detailed documenting. Before we go more in depth on shift notes, let's take a look at clocking in and out and where to find your shift notes. Shift notes can be found in the Better Together Supports portal. The first thing you'll need to do is sign in to the portal. This may look different depending on the device that you're using, but you'll go to the Better Together Supports dashboard after you've signed in, and you'll use the time shift clock in, clock out. You'll want to go ahead and sign in with your client. You'll need to select your shift type and make sure that you're entering an address for EVV verification. I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. Once you've clocked in, you can go ahead and close this out. For this video, I'm going to return to my dashboard. And I'm going to go back to the time shifts and clock out. Once you've gone to clock out, it will pop up your shift notes. I'm going to go ahead and put placeholders in here for now, as we're going to go more into depth on what is required in your shift notes throughout this video. After you've put in your shift notes in, you can save your notes, and then when you're all done, you're satisfied with your notes, you're going to go ahead, pick your address again, and submit. As you can see, here is my shift notes and what I put in. More detailed instructions for clocking in and clocking out can be found in the portal training videos. Now that we know where to find the shift notes, let's dive deeper into what it will look like day to day. These notes need to be submitted at the end of each shift and should be based on the goals outlined in the individualized support plan. Shift notes help us ensure that we're staying on track with client care and documenting the progress or challenges that arise during our shifts. Each shift note should reflect the specific goals you worked on with your client that day. Your education specialist will review the client's goals and the strategies for implementing them during your ISP review. If at any point you can't remember the goals or need more details, reach out to your education specialist for guidance. Let's take an in-depth look at the shift notes now. Remember that shift notes should reflect and be based on goals outlined in the ISP. There are 4 required entries for each shift note. The goal, which ISP goal did you work on with your client today? The action, what actions did you take to support your client in achieving their goals? The situation, in what specific situations did you work on these goals with your client? And the result, what was the outcome of working towards these goals with your client? There are also 2 optional sections in your shift notes. Significant events. Did anything important happen during your shift, such as challenging behaviors, injuries, or another significant event? If you do use the significant events section, ask yourself whether the issue requires an incident report, or in some cases, if it was serious enough to warrant an abuse report. This section is not required, so if nothing significant happened, it's acceptable to skip this question. It is important to follow up with these additional steps if needed so that the situations can be properly addressed. There is also a space for additional notes. This is just for any extra information you think may be useful but isn't required. Lastly, remember to save your notes. There's a button down here that's available to use throughout your shift. This is so you can document events as they happen rather than waiting until the end of the shift. This helps keep your notes accurate and detailed. Remember to complete your notes before you clock out though. Let's look at examples of good shift notes from a day with positive outcomes. While positive outcomes are great, it's important to remember that not every day will result in progress, and that's okay. For this example, we'll focus on comparing and contrasting good and poor examples of shift notes from a day where goals were successfully achieved. Let's start with a good example. Today, we worked on improving communication skills. We also worked on easy cooking skills and safety in the kitchen. We used picture cards and verbal prompts to help the client express their needs during interactions, helped the client find an online recipe they were able to complete with some assistance, and modeled safety using the oven. We searched online for recipes, and the client used their picture cards and responded to verbal prompts. We were able to choose a recipe and work on light cooking using available kitchen tools and the oven. While we were prepping and cooking, we went over kitchen safety, such as using oven mitts and turning the oven off and on safely. The client was able to use their picture cards while searching for the recipe and prepping to cook. The client verbalized water and eggs. The client used the oven mitts but forgot to turn off the oven until prompted. So what makes these good shift notes? This example documents the goal, actions taken, and specific progress the client made, even noting areas for future improvement, like remembering to turn off the oven. Now, let's contrast that with a poor example of a positive outcome. Yes, we worked on the goal. Made brownies and talked. We worked hard to make progress. Progress made. Hopefully, the difference between these shift notes is immediately obvious, but let's talk about why these are considered poor. These responses are vague and lack the necessary details to understand what goals were worked on, what actions were taken, and how the client progressed. Now let's look at examples of good shift notes from a day with a negative outcome. Not every day will go as planned, and that's perfectly normal. Even when goals aren't achieved, good shift notes can still provide valuable information. For this example, we'll compare and contrast good and poor examples of shift notes from a day where the outcome wasn't positive. For the goal, I might put, today we tried to work on communication skills. We plan to work on cooking skills and kitchen safety. For the action, encourage the client to choose a brownie recipe that we could bake together. Prompted the client to use their picture cards and vocalize familiar words. Modeled measuring ingredients and discussed oven safety prior to finding a recipe. After describing the actions that I took, I would go on to talk about the specific situation. We searched online for recipes, and the client used their picture cards and responded to verbal prompts. When we could not find a recipe with walnuts as an ingredient, the client became upset and refused to engage with the picture cards. I let the client know that we could add walnuts, but we made little progress for the remainder of the shift. Lastly, I would add my results. I encouraged the client to take a break and engage in a preferred activity instead. As a result, we were not able to complete the recipe or work on kitchen safety skills. We will revisit this goal when the client is more engaged. While this example did not have a positive outcome, it did have all of the things that we needed for shift notes. It included the goal, improving communication and practicing kitchen safety, the actions taken, using picture cards, verbal prompts, and supporting recipe selection. And it clearly documents the situation, the client's frustration, and results, taking a break and planning to try again. This level of detail ensures that the shift is accurately documented, even though the outcome wasn't positive. Let's compare that with a poor example for a negative outcome. For a goal, I might put something like, no, client wouldn't cooperate. For the action, tried to make brownies and talked. For the situation, the client didn't want to keep going. And for the result, unsuccessful. I hope you can see the difference between these two shift notes. This example is vague and lacks detail. It does not specify the actual goal being addressed. the actions taken to support the client, or provide context about the situation. It also fails to explain how the client responded or what steps we should take next. This kind of note does not provide enough information for tracking progress or planning future activities. When evaluating shift notes, it's important to consider a few key factors. If notes are vague and don't give a clear picture of what happened, they aren't helpful to the client's team. For example, simply saying "worked on communication" without explaining how or what was done to support the client is not enough. On the other hand, notes can have too much detail. If you document every single action, you may lose sight of the actual goal you're working toward. Focus on goal-related actions and outcomes rather than every single interaction that happened during your shift. Remember, a sentence or two will often do. Also avoid generic and repetitive notes. If your shift notes are the same every day, this is a sign that something might need to change. Maybe this is a goal that doesn't need attention every shift, or perhaps the ISP needs to be updated to reflect different priorities. An example of a repetitive note might be "worked on communication, client asked for water using picture cards." If this is written every day, it may be time to reassess whether the goal needs to be adjusted, or has the client already achieved mastery of it? When shift notes are well written, they provide valuable insight for both the client's team and future planning. Here's what you should look for in your own shift notes. Good shift notes are clear and directly related to the ISP goals. They include specific details about the actions taken to support the client. For example, instead of "worked on communication," a good note would say "used picture cards and verbal prompts to help the client ask for utensils during lunch." This gives a clear picture of what was worked on and how the support was provided. Effective notes stay focused on the key goals set out in the ISP. They don't get bogged down in unnecessary detail, but provide enough information to understand what happened and why it matters. Most importantly, a good note also highlights progress towards the client's goal. For example, I might say, "Client successfully used the cards to ask for water and started to say the word water with minimal prompting." This shows tangible improvements and keeps the team informed on how the client is moving toward their desired outcomes. In summary, shift notes should reflect consistent work towards goals identified in the individualized support plan. Shift notes should also show flexibility in supporting the client's needs. Good notes evolve over time, showing a variety of activities and how they tie into the client's goals. If notes show the same activity every day, it could be a signal that you need a new approach. Are you adjusting your strategies based on the client's state or preferences for the day? Are preferred activities or new opportunities being introduced to engage the client more fully? Shift notes should also reflect progress and variation. Did the client master the original goal and move on to a more challenging aspect? Are new activities being introduced to support the goal in a different way? Good notes always tie back to the ISP goals while documenting meaningful progress. Don't forget to reflect on how the current shift's progress will impact the next shift and future planning.